This is where we left off on the last YouTube video, where we were looking at this poor ponderosa pine just struggling to get enough sunshine to grow, and yet this very healthy looking grand fir having a nice array of needles nicely laid out, facing straight up, because overall that's where the light's going to come from. So maximum collection of solar radiation, lots of surface area. Who's going to win the photosynthesis war? As I said, I'm betting on the grand fir. And in the environment, you might notice back here, for those of you who've had a little experience in this, what's that tree? That's ponderosa pine, right? So this is an environment, very importantly, historically, occasionally of fire. And if you have a fairly regular fires, you can keep all this kind of brushy stuff burned up. And guess what? It's pretty tough for any of these small trees to grow at all, right? Now, if some of the pines can make it up a little larger, they do have more resistant bark, and eventually they'll resist the fire. But on the other hand, this fir is not going to make it if there's any fire at all. Even when it gets larger, it doesn't have a bark that's really resistant to that. So the grand fir doesn't. But here's the thing. Over time, there's an interesting dynamic that happens. And this is up a little farther up that highway I showed you earlier, the McKenzie Highway, and on the east side of the Cascades, Central Oregon. If you look what's going on here in this photo, I took this, I was out mountain biking, I think it was spring break a few years ago over there. Maybe no, I'm at 5 years ago, I think now I took it. And you can see some interesting things. You can see the fire scarring here a little bit. Okay, another over there. And yet the ponderosa pines can handle a lot of fire, so they survive. What you see, and these are the big trunk ones. These are all the bigger ones here are ponderosa pine, pretty much. I can't tell for sure. So I think all of those are bigger. The big ones are ponderosa pine. But what's going on though? Okay, apparently not a real recent fire. Because look who's coming up underneath the shade, okay? That's these grand firs, and they grow better in the shade. And you don't see a lot of ponderosa pines making a stand here, do you? It's the grand fir. So in the absence of these fire events, the grand fir does well growing up in the shade of the ponderosa pine. And eventually, as the pines succumb to disease, wind blow down, and so on, maybe the bark beetles will get some of them as they get older, then it'll be the grand firs who are in charge, or maybe not. So I'm really glad I took this photo. I love this area, and this no longer exists. Okay, the Millie fire of maybe it was three. Let's see, I think it was 3 summers ago now, up above Sisters, destroyed this entire forest. Some of the big trees, the snags are kind of still standing there, but all of these fir trees, they're done. Okay, and most of the pines too. It was a very hot, very destructive fire. There was too much fuel, too much brush. Didn't have a recent fire, as you can tell here when I took this before the big fire. And so it destroyed some very large areas of forest, including some of the middle-sized ponderosa pines and some of the older ones too. Now, some of the big pines survived in some of those areas, some didn't. But so this is the story. So all this growth here was for naught. Okay, and that's not an uncommon story. All right. And so in response to that, land managers have they've kind of figured this out. And by the way, have to say something. You know the whole dry summer, wet winter thing. Well, if you take all the like the Yale School of Forestry, the most significant kind of thought center of forestry in the so-called the Americas, heavily influenced by European forestry thought, where most of the forests in Europe are not in areas of dry summers, in the central and northern parts. And so they didn't really get a handle on why the Native Americans were so intent on using fire. So we got these catastrophic burns here because we have too much going on there near the surface. The limbs, everything else helps the fires run up the trees. But what's going on is that they're doing a lot of, this was actually a thicker stand of trees here. You can tell there's been some burns through here. This is near Sisters. These are pines, the ponderosa pine. Now this is in that kind of transitional area or ecotone between the pine forest and the more open kind of woodland of a, these are called western junipers. Let me get you a look at those as well. The western juniper is not there. It's right there. Okay, we showed that earlier. So these are the what grow out in this open areas, and what I was showing you is that transition between the pines that say, down to maybe 13, 14 inches of precipitation, and then the junipers dominate in areas that are a little drier. Okay, so what they're doing anyway is they're clearing out some of this stuff. They're making burns, and they do that usually in October after there's been some decent rain, so there isn't a danger of these fires getting out of control. Clearing, it takes lots of labor. And unfortunately, in our capitalist system, it's been really, really hard to justify this. How do you pay people to go do this in national forest land? It takes effort to do that. It's expensive. You got to hire humans to do the work, and so on. And so it took a long, long time for us to come to this. But really, the whole firing thing is really where the action's at. And now you'll see this. If you go around those great pine forests in this zone where I'm talking about, this time of year, they're out there doing their burning. And it's kind of annoying, got the smoke and stuff, but it's how you keep from having worse wildfires. And in the end, the ecosystem does pretty well. The pines dominate, not so much the western junipers. And we'll come back to western junipers a little later, okay? Now, another tree I wanted to show you here is, let's see, and this is not, you see some of these in that Central Oregon area. This is called the western larch, okay? Now, a lot of people like to call them tamarack, and there is, in fact, an eastern tamarack, but there is actually larch, but people call them tamarack, so I'm not going to quibble with that. It's a popular name, it's fine. But this is a tree that has an interesting characteristic. It's not like the other coniferous trees in the region in that it has yellow needles in the fall that fall off. They're green and then they turn yellow and they fall off, more like a deciduous habitat, okay? And so they are an amazing tree. They grow really, really fast. They make pretty good wood. They're mostly, you'll find some of them in kind of northeastern Oregon, but mostly they're like in extreme north central Washington and up into Canada where you see them, and also in the northern Idaho region as well. You'll see some of these. So this is a larch. So that's what we're talking about here, the western larch. Okay, they're pretty shade intolerant, and so they tend to grow up in areas where there isn't much competition. And in fact, I've got a photo here of those somewhere, I think. We'll just run through real quickly here. I think it, yeah. This is this is actually a stand of them that's a little rare, but it's over near Subtle Lake on Highway 2218, coming down into Central Oregon, going past Black Butte, basically is right where you see it, just before you get to Black Butte Ranch on the right side. And so you can see this, I managed to time this in the early fall. See how they're just starting to yellow here, okay? And so, yeah, they're a real vigorous grower, those larch are. And by the way, you can tell the old fires had been here, but it's all kind of grown up again now. And I don't know, I haven't been through here in a few years, whether this area here is still been fire free, but this starts to be, as you know, an issue. We talked about that. But they do have the spacing of the ponderosas a little further apart, so it's a little less hazardous. We're also getting some of the manzanita brush growing up in there too. We talked about the manzanita already. Okay. So, all right, so that's this environment. I wanted to show you some other interesting things. There's the Columbia Snake Basalt Plateau, it's usually sage, and then you've got sloughs and lakes in these areas where you have that. You get marsh grasses as well. Now, the sagebrush is Madro tertiary geoflora. You've got bunch grass, which is also from the Madro tertiary, and some of the flowering plants are too. And the western juniper is Madro tertiary. Wow, yeah, mostly Madro tertiary. Look at that. Sage bunch grasses. Rabbit brush is another one that's that way. So really, if you go to this zone, let's say in the Basalt Plateau, and also areas of say further south in Central Oregon, western juniper woodlands, these are really vegetation, not so much uh, from the Arctotertiary, but really from the more neotropical Madrotertiary geoflora. Very different vegetation from very different origins. Okay, and again, ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. These are, you'll find these in some of these areas when there's greater than 15 inches of precipitation. Depends on where you are. And then also there's the basin and range uh, in the area of south central Oregon and southern Idaho to some degree. And here again, depending on the elevation, you'll either get sagebrush, bunch grasses, and so on lowered. Some trees, if you get high enough, but at the lower elevations, not so much. More of the sage, bunch grasses. A lot of what we call internally drained basins. And I wanted to spend just a tiny bit of time on that. What we have here is, see, that's not it. I'm just trying to find, I'm going to pause just for a moment. Hang on. Okay, I'm back. I had it in front of me, but it was the atlas. I just had it on the wrong page. I didn't recognize it. But this is a map again, and we're going to look at this. So we've been looking at these east slopes, the Cascades, and now we're into some of these areas where there's the highlands, like the whole Blue Mountains kind of region of highlands, if you will. And this would be kind of a characterization of that, okay, like the Blue Mountains region, and even extend a little beyond it. But then in the south here, you get this northern basin range, both in Oregon and northern Idaho. And what you find in these areas, and also interestingly up parts of central Washington, what you'll find is a map of these are wetlands. Now, what's going on here? So here, these are areas, you probably remember this from the climate part, but these are very dry places. I mean, most of this is kind of 10, 12 inches of rain, even a little drier in some parts of south central Washington. These areas here, very dry. And yet there's all these wetlands. How could you have wetlands in an area that's so dry? And what about this area of high density wetlands? Do you remember where this is? What is this called? Remember the Missoula floods? These are the channeled scablands. You just had a question or two on that. That related to that in the exam. Some of the evidence of those big Missoula floods. So you have all these wetlands. Some of them are along rivers like Willamette Valley, and so you get all these wetlands. That's not surprising. But here we are in this very dry environment. These are internally drained basins. What does that mean? It means when water flows down a slope after a rainfall or melting snow or whatever it is, the water has nowhere to go. It basically accumulates in the lowest basins nearby. There's no river that drains out of this area. The water stays there. Isn't that a weird concept? Okay, those are internally drained basins. So there's lots of wetlands. There are lakes, a lot of dry lake beds as well, like Summer Lake, for example, not too far from Bend if you've been there. But so that's just a little quirky thing there. But much of this is western juniper, where you do have trees or bunch grasses, sage, rabbit brush, and so on. Okay. So that's this area across here mostly. And you get kind of similar vegetation in some of these other areas in southwestern Idaho as well. And also you get some of that juniper woodland in parts of, Washington State in the interior, the drier interior. And by the way, unfortunately, we don't have an atlas that continues up. But if you were to go up into British Columbia up in here, it looks pretty much like central Washington, a lot of these long valleys. You have the same trees growing, the same bushes. A lot of them are drought adapted, and so it's really surprising to a lot of people when they go up that far north. So what? So that's basically a quick summary then of this region. We're going to later look at the whole question of western junipers in some material. So that's up next. But this is largely. Oh, one other thing. Okay, I knew I was forgetting something. Okay, we're going to do this region uh, in its own unit, but it's basically where we are and also the Puget Sound. And we're going to talk about fire as a whole story there. Okay, so that's coming up pretty soon.